Good afternoon, and thank you to my NIOS colleagues for inviting me to speak here. I want to talk to you about the New Zealand version of open vocational skills development with a focus on the school-age children, even though my own organisation is focused on the tertiary level, but I'll talk a bit more about that. I wasn't sure that everybody would know where New Zealand is, so we're in the far right-hand corner there, those two little islands down the bottom. I come from Wellington, which is the capital city, and that gives you a quick snapshot of what it can look like. In terms of a bit of context, we have 0.3% of the population of India, 10% of the area. In 2010, we came third in the world in terms of development, which is a mixture of life expectancy, education and income. And you can see the main ways that we generate income. Those are our main export industries. In terms of education, in 2009, we were first equal in the Global Education Index, which is a mixture of adult literacy and also the gross enrolment rate, which I know has been talked about a bit at this conference. And I actually looked it up this morning when I woke up, because I'm still a bit on New Zealand time. And I thought, well, 107%. But I think that's because we have a lot of people that return to education. And I know you have aspirations of 30%, so we're in quite different situations. But I wanted to pick up particularly on the fact that we do well in vocational education measures as well. We have high entry rates and then also achieve well. And part of that, which I was discussing with some of the panellists before, is that vocational education is very highly regarded in New Zealand. People don't see it as an inferior way of earning an income. And some of our history, where we've been valuing it for over 100 years, is a major contributor to that. So in terms of just defining what I'm thinking of when I talk about vocational education, it's really education that's focused on what you need to actually work, get a job. In terms of the sort of drivers globally that are increasing the value of vocational education, there's this ongoing change that means in any country, and still in New Zealand, there's a need for people to go back and retrain. So my own institution, the average age of learners is 29. We have a lot of adults who choose to study with us because of the flexibility. Also, jobs that you used to be able to do and not need skills, they are increasingly important. So an example would be, we've just had a major project developing financial skills. So to be a financial advisor in New Zealand, you used to not need a qualification, whereas now the government has legislated that you do need a qualification. And also when people train, those skills wear out. So there's this lifelong learning. And then my understanding is in developing countries like India, because there's been that emphasis on basic education, there's now the driver for vocational education because those people are coming out and need skills. So that's not so relevant in New Zealand, but it's certainly very relevant globally. I also wanted to talk about what open education and distance education mean, because as we've been starting to work in India, I've sensed that we're not necessarily meaning the same thing. So for me, when I'm talking, the open education is about minimising the barriers, whereas distance education is about the teacher and the learner being in a separate place, as the term distance communicates, but also it tends to mean that they're separated by time and not necessarily interacting at the same time in the same place. So when the Open Polytechnic talks about distance education, we actually don't have any face-to-face interaction with our students. So it's the vast majority of our courses are 100% distance education. And then there's another term that's bandied about a lot, flexible education, which is really about increased choice. And obviously distance education tends to give that choice because you can choose when and where you study. but also the modularisation of courses and the transferability between institutions increases choice for learners and thus makes education more flexible. And so what is it that's driving open and distant vocational education? That flexibility is particularly important, and as I've talked about in New Zealand, the potential for people to go back and retrain and be able to generate income or still look after families for women returning to the workplace means that the flexibility is really important to them. Also, it can increase access and enable people who aren't close to an institution to be able to study. It's highly scalable, can be cost effective and consistent, and I'll talk some more about that. In terms of vocational education, there's three models. So the formal secondary, which can be distance or classroom based, formal tertiary, which is my own institution, and then informal training. So there's non-accredited short courses or a traditional apprenticeship, which doesn't give you a formal qualification at the end, which my understanding is that's a very common model in India for vocational education, whereas in New Zealand, we tend to have formal secondary and formal tertiary, and the sort of things you'd have short courses for would be a bit of upskilling by your workplace where you might do a communication skills course. Also, you can have private, public and non-governmental organisations involved. So that does mean that vocational education is a lot more complex than higher education, which tends to be just a public or a private university, which I think makes it more challenging for policymakers. I want to talk about what I think are the 6 aspects of ideal distance vocational education, and then talk about how New Zealand achieves each of those things. So how do we make our vocational education relevant? We have industry training organisations which were established in the 1990s, whose job it is to facilitate interaction with industry to define what it is that industry value in a job. So for a plumber, what is it that a plumber needs to be able to do to be a good plumber? And then those are cobbled together into a qualification which goes on the national framework. And each of the competencies come together in unit standards, and some of those unit standards will sit across qualifications, like good communication skills might be present in a whole lot of qualifications, whereas the ability to install a hot water cylinder would only be in a plumbing qualification. And in terms of linking that with schools, we have what's called a gateway program where secondary school students can, who are seeing themselves heading into a vocational area, although they may choose not to and end up going on to higher education, they have the opportunity while they're in their last years of school to study for unit standards and to have some time out in a workplace. So it gives them the chance to actually experience the workplace that they might be interested in. And then we also have growing involvement of industry training organisations in our schools, like the electricity ITO runs what they call the Bright Sparks program, where they give secondary school students the opportunity to do study for some unit standards that will then be able to contribute to their actual qualification, but they also get to work with an electrician part of the time. We also work at making vocational education relevant by how we assess. So part of these competencies that are defined are 21st century skills. So it's actually made overt in the qualification that people need to be able to work in teams. They need to be able to solve problems. So the competencies and what's decided to be important in the qualification and therefore what's measured are those skills. Also working towards problem-based, project-based, team-based and work-based assessment rather than rote memorisation assessment. And then that flows back to how you teach the program because you're preparing them for how you're going to measure that. And also technology enables quite different forms of assessment in vocational education. For example, you can take a mobile video of somebody doing a practical task and then submit that as evidence that they're able to do that. rather than it just relying on written versions, and then people can put up portfolios. There's also an emphasis on the person in the workplace actually verifying that they've done certain things. In terms of how we make vocational education accessible, openness is not really a problem for schooling in New Zealand because schooling is compulsory until the age of 16. And we don't insist on a level of achievement before you progress to the next level. So people end up following different paths based on what they've achieved, but they're not limited in terms of getting into that next level. I want to talk